Yeah, well, that's just, I suppose that was something I was interested in and something that somebody had said to me kind of along the way. I think it was a piece I was doing a while ago, actually. Can't remember, but one of the participants, it was a traveler, they said they actually thought that things had gotten worse since the ethnicity piece was recognized, and then I think I was watching or listening to one of your podcasts, and I suppose that kind of interested me, the how it's been framed as traveller ethnicity rather than indigenous. And of course the difference is huge, isn't it? Because it does when you think about ethnicity, you don't have that sense of coming from the land. Whereas when you talk about indigenous, you do have that sense. So I suppose that's what I wanted to ask you about, really your take on that and where that might be going. And then that like that DNA research, has that been helpful or a hindrance to the community? And I suppose where do you go from there with it, really?
Yeah. Where do we even start? Because it's so much to take in. Um, you'd have to kind of clear your mind and just visualize Ireland as a green slate. There is no English here, there is no empire, and there was no conquest. And what you'd have then is a very complex Gaelic world. And within that world, it's very much like Christianity. We can have 34,000 different dominions, Catholics, Protestants, Presbyterians, and so on and so forth. You can have all these different languages, different ethnicities, different nationalities, but yet they're hooked into the same overall arching mentality of Christianity. So the Gaelic culture was very much like that, or different dialects, or different kinds of mini cultures. Eventually you'll have Norman, you'll have Old English, you'll have Spanish, because it was a Gaelic mentality. It wasn't a Gaelic geneticist Irish people only. It was a culture, a way of seeing the world. So when we're coming at this is where we're coming from. We came from that world. So the one we're in right now, this present moment, hasn't changed since the English had colonized it. You've got Trinity College, Maynooth College, you've got King's Inn College, you've got the Royal College of Surgeons. You've all of these English institutions that never changed in 1922. And to continue to educate the general population into seeing the world through an English lens, reading English books. So in that world, when they were looking out at the last remaining of the Gaelic culture, they were looking at these people that are now calling Irish travellers. And prior to that, we would be called thinkers and then itinerants. So all of these labels, when you chase after them, they all lead back to the origins of English colonization, who had put these labels on a Gaelic culture at one point or another. So, and this is where it gets more complex, because a lot of the settled population, when we say settled, we're talking about systems and institutions. We're not talking about the individuals, because it doesn't take a rocket science to work out. We got the same skin complexion, we got on the same island, we've got even the same surnames.
Names, yeah.
So to think that somehow or another we're so different, or we're not related to each other, was always a bit bonkers in our books anyways. But what you do have, which is important to all of what we're talking about, there is a divergence, there is a separation, not just in the genetic markers, but more so psychologically. It's when the English are putting up their institutions, start employing vagrancy acts and martial laws and penal laws and everything they could do to break down the psychological world of the Gaelic world. And eventually, because the systems haven't changed, and that happened so long ago has been in the past. And especially when that something had never been switched off or never had been changed, but then it's still in the present. It isn't history. It's only history, I think, if you're taught to think it in that kind of way of thinking of history. And that kind of brings us back into the state, I suppose, and the settled identity, is that from that world looking outwards, they're looking for travelers. They're looking for travelers in ancient history. The problem that they're making is that they're looking for travelers through the lens of an English educational institution that created these labels in the first place. So if we go back just a little bit in the Gaelic world, there is no travellers. You can't find travellers in the past because the label didn't exist. It didn't mean the culture and the ethnicity didn't exist, it just meant that label didn't. And then when we move thinkers and itinerants, again, as I mentioned, they're all born out of colonization. It's like looking through the world through an English mentality. And they were trying to look for a Gaelic culture. So when they come across things like nomadism and intermarriages and arranged fights, and they find this all bizarre and strange, and then we're finding it all bizarre and strange, is at the same time to call themselves Gaelic people. They're talking about Hugh O'Neill and Red O'Donnell and the Flight of the Earls and the bards and the poets and the musicians. And we're like, yeah, that's who we are. We've never stopped being them people. But in an English settled one today, because you're educated to see us in a particular way, they think we're the itinerants and the thinkers and the travellers. The same labels the English had put on the Gaelic people in the first place. Sorry for that bit of a rant, but I hope it helps.
Yeah, and so and it like is the link then with nomadism, like if you go back, I mean, like are we like, because so much of traveler culture seems to be based around this nomadic identity and the nomadic as a state of mind, really, rather than even as a state of being, you know, which kind of I think taps into what you're saying. But if you go back then to before colonization, is there evidence of nomadic people, or is there evidence of nomadic people is what I'm trying
to this one over to Dylan, but I just sort of maybe add to that by saying that you'll find the beginnings of nomadism in Ireland. It actually has a history.
Yeah.
But again, it's done from an English perspective. What nomadism is, who nomads will be, who vagabonds will be, and so on and so forth. So when we're looking at it now, we're looking at the English version, looking for nomadism and nomads. But in a Gaelic world, as Dylan will tell you,
you have two. Yeah, sorry, right, yeah. I'm expecting you to stop.
It's like that.
No,
I'm always conscious because that's his department and he likes his history, so I don't want to go in there messing
yeah,
up.
well, no, yeah, I was going to say that, but no, well, you're asking about the past there, exactly. So that's from archaeology, like, but it's a good question with nomadism, but we would go through that. There's two things going on there, actually. There's what society was like before, say me and Bernard usually put around the 16th century as around the time that Ireland gets conquered, okay?
Okay.
So we say that just before, so right up to that point, most of Ireland is still a Gaelic culture. That's fine. Most people accept that or know that. So there's what that culture is like and how whether people are moving and how they're moving and what the ideas are about whether, you know, what's normal, where you're supposed to move and all the rest. Is one thing, and then the other thing is what Bernard's talking about is the ideas we've inherited from the state that was constructed under colonialism, where they had invested a very strong interest in this idea of nomadism, because they were reading classical texts in terms of when they were building the empire, and the whole concept was that the old Roman law had said that if you were moving into land where there was nomads, then it was free to take the land, essentially.
Okay.
So there was a large impetus legally, and even an English thing, to they use this thing called the lex nullius, the law of, you know, that it's uninhabited. They were very constantly going on about the wasteland. It's not ploughed properly. They're not living on it, right? You know. And so there's this idea the Irish were compared to Scythians, the old Greek, when the Greeks used to go on about the barbarians, or the Romans would, or whatever. So they're consistently comparing the Irish way of life to this nomadic way of life, but with a legal kind of construct on it.
Yeah.
Okay. So we would argue that we've inherited quite a lot of that on one side, right? So all the laws, as Bernard points out, then that those laws, they then enact laws to enforce that kind of point of view.
Yeah.
Displace someone or you might knock down, you know. So the Irish didn't actually build a lot of, well, we did have we had stone castles, and we had stone churches and things like this, and they were there, and the English knew well that they were there, but also we didn't have an urban civilization in the sense that the continent did, if you know what I mean. That had bypassed a lot of Ireland was a different mentality or different culture in that regard, and so it was, you know, if you could knock the castle down, then it was easier to sort of say, well, actually, look, there isn't anything here. They're moving from place to place, because a lot of Irish did with their cattle and stuff, but mostly in circuits. And actually, it wouldn't even have been alien in England in the years before that. But you know, if you go into that whole history in the 16th century, you'll realize they're actually enforcing this idea of settling everybody in one place. They're actually doing it in England as well with the Enclosure Acts and things like this.
Okay.
But in England, of course, it's different because it's not targeted against an entire culture like it is in Ireland. And so, but the other side of it is nomadism. Well, no, we would have when you look at Gaelic society, you would find that there's no more nor less movement, say, than a lot of medieval societies, in the sense that people are moving cattle up to the mountains in the summer. Some aspects of the society are more mobile than others. A lot of people in those days, how would we put it? Rather than going to a town, it's kind of the other way around now. Rather than going to town to get services, shall we say, in a Gaelic world, it's more likely that they would come to you in a cyclic pattern, you know? So, people, you know, like bards would move, soldiers would move, you know, the going to fairs, that kind of thing. So we have this opposite thing. This, like, a lot of the society was able to move in circuits and things. It was just normal. They moved around. They had circuits around Connacht. They had circuits around Ulster. They had, and some of them smaller or larger than others. They're seasonal. Go to places where big fairs will be held. I mean, we kind of partly know this kind of thing. And of course, it will be difficult in Ireland, on an island this big, to be fully kind of nomadic in the sense of wandering randomly from place to place like you would in Asia or something. But it's just not possible here. But yeah, we agree with what Bernard's saying. It's not. There is no. Yeah, the definition of the word nomad is kind of is the
construct. Yeah.
Yeah, they've constructed this whole thing that we have this idea that people are you see. Here's the crux of it. The idea, when we talk about nomadism, it's in contrast to people who are settled.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we go back past the 16th century, we now, as Bernard had pointed out about labels, the important thing is to understand is that now not only is there no concept of nomad, we also have no idea about what settled means. There is no settled.
Yeah.
At that time, well, there kind of is, but they're just in the town. They're in the English towns, like in Dublin and Cork and places like this. But outside of that is where that concept comes from. So in Gaelic society, there's nobody going around saying these guys are settled and these guys are nomads. There's no idea about that.
But post-colonialism, that idea emerges, is it? You know, is that when that idea emerges? And is it that the traveller community were resistant to being submerged into the constructs and the structures that were these British structures that were kind of brought in? So you know, and I'm even conscious now of using the word traveller because again it's the label, isn't it? But is it almost that the divide happened, that it was like a form of resistance?
Yeah. So you say that, Bernard. I mean, travellers themselves, I would say that the what we're talking about, a divide. So travellers' DNA and Irish history in general would point, even academic English history, if you want to put it that way, would point at all at about 1600s for a division in what you're saying, for the emergence of an identity of we say nomad, but back then
the split identity kind of happened around this. Yeah, these two identities started to happen.
I think it kind of emerged from the knightly titles that were offered, followed up by the surrender and regrant. Like if you look at the terms of the surrender and regrant, it's all about adapting an English education, an English school, English clothing, English style of customs and traditions, and swear allegiance to an English empire. So if you're one generation, two generation, three generation onwards, you're going to grow up in that reality, thinking that's your normal mentality and that everything is real from this perspective. But when you take a step back from it, you can see the physical structure, you can see the psychological being and all that goes into it emerging around that time. Sorry.
Well, no, so that's important. That's what I'm saying. That's what we would think is important, is to follow through the logic of, like, so the majority of the island is Gaelic culture, apart from the urban area around the Pale. Let's just stick it around 1500, say, and then the conquest the English start to expand the Pale, and as they do so, they're moving a frontier which beyond the Pale is the wild Irish in those days. So what me and Bernard will be saying that what they term wild Irish in that time, they would constitute a large the majority of the country, and but gradually over time, of course, as they conquer different areas, they'd settle. They start to actually enforce settlement. Literally, you can't move. There are laws you can't move. There's martial law. If you move, you can be killed. It's as simple as that. And so they then start to target various types of people. Now, actually, it's an irony that we talked about before, me and Bernard, quite often, that actually the people who had horses and who would have been mobile in the old days in the Gaelic society would have been the more well off. So those who moved would have been better off in society, whereas the bottom of the society, like the ones without them who just walked around, didn't move as much, but they would have had less status. Now, we know under those laws that the state from Dublin was particularly targeting people who were soldiers, people who were poets, people who had knowledge of the past, people who were a threat in any way to the state's narrative. And so that's what and the reason we think that's important, of course, is that that's the inherited thing even to this day in the state. We would say that it's been all of that law and actually the kind of concept has been transferred and is still stuck, is still on travelers, if you know what I mean. Even as that population's been reduced over the centuries, particularly, from the famine onward, let's say.
You were to take also where travellers are at this present moment in the physical world, in the settled community, you'll see all our statistics, which are all of them are horrible. And despite the fact with good intentions, good people, good researchers, investment, funding, even a certain willingness on part of the government, things were getting psychologically worse. And we're pinning that, and I have been most of my life anywhere, because one of the issues I had with the NGOs was the settled mentality. I didn't understand that. I didn't understand the colonization. And we didn't have very much education. I left school when I was young and I was put in the same classroom anywhere. So I didn't get no formal education. But we do grow up with an instinct of growing up in a culture or an identity that we're now, say, led mostly by settled people. These people had never left their positions of power and never engaged in any other narrative other than the one they create themselves. What's happening with the state, I think they were trying to construct this identity that they created in the 60s through the commission report.
Yeah.
And they came up with a definition themselves of who itinerant is going to be.
Yeah.
And they didn't give travellers a chance to say any different. So they created that construct, and to this day, it's still playing out, but it's doing so systematically for one, because it's unchanged systems, but also, I believe, subconsciously. I don't believe people are actually consciously aware that they're using the old institutions, the same attitudes, the same labels, because we take a huge step back. It looks kind of a bit off. It looks like the island is brainwashed, that they would still be using English labels and laws and acts to deal with the native people. That just doesn't sound right at all. People are not very conscious of this kind of history. So yeah, my point was, if you were to put travel statistics and all that on a charter, you'd see we are at the top. We are at the worst point of it. But beneath that, you'll find working class, you'll find the native Irish language, you'll find rural Ireland, you'll find Donegal, and places like this that are also, but if you put that on its side, you will see that we are on the same side. We came from the same West of Ireland Gaelic culture, regardless if you're rural Ireland or native Irish speaker. We all came that direction. And what we're in at the moment came from the East, came from Dublin. The Pale has its origins in Westminster. It goes back to Rome. It goes back to Hammurabi law, Moses law. It goes all that direction. But it came East. We came from the West. We're Gaels as opposed to anything else. Sorry, I do rant.
Fascinating. No, that's fascinating. And like, I was just thinking as well, it was a conversation I had. I met an Indian man at a conference and we were talking, and he thought I was British first of all, and then when I said I was Irish, he said, God, they did exactly the same in Ireland as they did in India. He said divide and conquer, and he said he was living in the UK, forced to live in the UK because he was there as a refugee, but and he said they did exactly the same. They divided, they pitted all the religions against each other, they pitted us against each other, they strengthened the caste system. And he said, and that's that's clearly what's going on in Ireland. But he said there seems to be a lot less awareness of it in Ireland than there is in India. And like when he said that, that really struck me, because I kind of thought, like, I mean, like yourself, Bernard, but I left school early, but I went back to education, and I don't remember ever in my education, whether it was in school, whether it was my degree, my master's, my PhD, I never, ever have examined the impact of colonialism on my being. Or, you know, and if you look at, you know, like I wrote, as part of my PhD, I looked at intergenerational trauma, and I was looking at the impact of, you know, the residential schools and the industrial schools on, you know, and on, you know, trauma. And sure, now there's, you know, there's the evidence that like the DNA of the children of Holocaust survivors is, you know, they've got the same trauma in their DNA, regardless of whether they were actually present at the Holocaust or not. So the trauma that's kind of passed down. And it was when it was this conversation with this man made me think, God, you know, this is something I never hear discussed. And I mean, in all my education, I've never engaged in a critical discussion or a self-reflective process on how has this, and yet it's still so alive, because we see it in the North, the South, the Catholics, the Protestants, you know. And yeah, so I suppose my question to you two was really like, how has this, do you think, impacted, okay, these constructs of traveller and settled, you know, how has colonialism in particular impacted yeah, this idea of the two separate identities? I mean, you've touched on that already, but in particular, I suppose I'm interested in the racism, you know?
Oh, yeah. Well, you can answer that one, Bernard. But I was just going to say before you do that, you asked about DNA a short time ago.
Yeah.
Or how does that, you know? And I was just going to say that, like, because we're working off, the DNA had it had a large impact on the historical narrative from our point of view. I suppose because we were probably already looking at things a little this way around, but the DNA is important because getting a narrative to kind of stick is a difficult thing when it's, for example, what you're talking about, colonialism, a long history in Ireland of because Dublin's coming from a different tradition, if we want to put it that way. It's often denied colonialism as even existent. There's all these arguments. You see papers in the 80s and even 90s and more and on saying, well, Ireland wasn't even a colony. What are you talking about? Colonialism isn't relevant here. We weren't a colony. We were part of the UK. It's all fine. Don't worry about it. You know what I mean? It's like this kind of thing. Now, we obviously would disagree with that, and many others have or do, and you'll see little bits of academic research into Ireland as a colony and all the rest. But it's a long. Sorry.
Unless you're from Dublin, it's all.
Yeah. Well, it's quite a long battle because and we know the history of that. It's not just about. It's because Dublin was the English colony and was an English city and had an English identity until the 17th century that was very strong. And so when it's adopted an Irish identity, it cannot access the English identity. That's not allowed. So we can't talk about colonialism, if you know what I mean, until we acknowledge that Dublin was an English city that was in part of the conquest of the country, and the rest of the country has, you know, and there's a patchwork of history between Normans, French, Irish, Gaels, as Bernard said, Norsemen, doesn't matter, you know, everybody. But and they're all equally, you know, they're all part of the history of the fabric of the country, and we've no issue with that. But we would say as well, though, that and many who are studying the kind of colonial aspects of Ireland, you need to bring out that, for example, that the conquest, that Dublin's English identity is part of the story, and some people would identify this suppression of the colonial thing by the school system and by everything else is because Dublin has decided that everyone has this one national Irish identity, and therefore we can't investigate these different identities that existed on the island before. If you see what I mean, it was part of the national agenda or whatever. And then I would just say that the DNA was important because, just for a very simple reason. The first bit being that it shows that both travellers and settled population in general come from the one source population, more or less.
Okay.
So that's very important. And the second one is that we also find split at the time that me and Bernard are talking about. Yeah. So So we would try to base. It's just a base, and it doesn't have anything to do with identity, as Bernard will explain to you a bit better than me. But it is our foundation for a sort of scientific foundation that we kick off from, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
So that's all I say there. That's why it's important to us, because
also came along the second branch of science where we did it on the gut bacteria of Irish travellers, microbiome or something like that it's called. And basically they found that the bacteria was a pre-industrial ancient bacteria that differs from the settled population and is found in travellers. So what they meant by pre-industrial was something older than 500 years old, something that was beyond colonization. And then another reference popped up in the legal world by Judge Gerard Hogan, where he also recognized that there was issue since the formation of the state with these people's identity. In other words, he was trying to say, hey, I think, was that we've been using English laws on Gaelic culture in Ireland, telling everyone that they're actually Irish laws, but they're not. They all have their origins in King's Inn. We didn't have a king called Henry. We would have remembered him if we did. But yeah, today they're just little nuggets that there's recognition that something isn't quite right here. And it isn't about blame, because we're not trying to say that we are Gaels, somebody else isn't. Gael is a complex idea itself. It's not to do with genetics. It's not to do with nationalities. It didn't understand any of concepts. It didn't have racism, because all them constructs came from and with colonization, including white, black, brown, and racism. All of them were also labels born out of colonization, and they didn't come from a Gaelic world. So that can kind of bring me maybe how we connect with India. Again, it's all about mentalities. We're all genetically related. So it's about psychology and cultural identities and so on and so forth. Nobody's trapped in the settle label, and there's nobody trapped in the settle or the traveller one. These are just constructs in our brain that we grew up with, but we can remove ourselves. And if we look at from again taking that distance outside the colony, as I call it, outside of all the colonial labels for a moment, and you can visualize Ireland back at a particular point when the English had arrived, and their idea was soon after arrival was actually, if we change the Irish psyche of these people, we can have them running around in circles in no time. We can put them into class systems and so on and so forth. And even when Hugh O'Neill went to the Pale and got his education, the first thing the Queen had said was, a creature of our own. In other words, we programmed this person to speak, talk, and communicate with us. So they realized that education became like a program, a very complex program, and that they could shift the psyche of people in time and over time. Would it be vocal education up to systematic specialized education? And then the education system itself was segregated. It was broken into three pieces by one institution. This is where you'll have the elites who run the schools, you'll have the middle classes who go to the universities, and then you've got the public schools that were designed for the masses. So even the whole construct of middle class, working class, and elite class are also colonial constructs. They don't come from a traveller / Gaelic world. So when they got there, they eventually worked out how to get these people, coerce them, educate them, forced education on them, break them down eventually. Then they took that after a couple of centuries of mauling down the world, they make it into something. Then they brought it to the West Indies, they brought it to Jamaica, they brought it to America, they brought it to India, and they brought it to all these other places. And they modeled their colonization on the other colonies based on the Irish experience, the Irish experiment of changing the psyche. And maybe that's something, again, Dylan might want to come in on. Or I'd say, I have no idea what you're talking about. But yeah, that's my understanding. So even the present day, what I'm trying to say, India, South Africa, Canada, Australia, they're all colonies. We're all sharing the same language. And if you look at the natives in them countries and the ethnic minorities in them countries, you will see that the statistics and the treatments and the attitudes are almost identical to Irish travellers. So why would that be happening? And again, it goes back to that whole colonial mentality that if you brought a people up without telling them their history, as you said, you never found it in your education. You couldn't find it in the institutions. Where was it? It was removed. Dylan studied a specialised kind of history, and he too had to stumble and go searching and seeking for that because it was never made ready available. So if we had that, that's where the whole traveller settle issue comes from. Where do travellers come from? The real question is, where did settled people come from? Where did their institutions come from? Where did their language come from? Where did their traditions come from? And so on and so forth. And when you work that part out, then you go, ah, now I see we're inside a colonial mentality and we can change it. Another round for me, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Were you going to add anything there?
Me? Well, no, no, it's quite. I thought I think he's explained it quite well.
Everything?
Well,
Cool.
I think that you've often mentioned it because a lot of this I bounce off Dylan. And the only see, this is another thing which makes all this kind of mystery deepen is that right up to the point of having Dylan involved, there never has been an archaeologist involved with any traveller research. And in the 1960s, they kind of said, okay, maybe let the historians go look for it, but we're not going to give them room. We're not going to invest in them. But we are going to ask every religious group, every association, we're going to ask Postman Pat and his black and white cat, do they have an opinion on itinerants? And if so, write it into us. But they pushed the historians and the archaeologists out of the way because they did not want to go into the history. And again, it's not trying to create this big grand conspiracy. It's all subconscious, as far as I can see. There is no evil Fianna Fáil or evil Fianna Gael. They did bad things, they got things wrong. We're still paying the price this moment because they cannot recognise, on one hand, they created the commission report. They took state actions to address what they perceived as a problem using English ideology, and then later had to recognise these people have an distinct culture, but didn't do it the previous decades, which again compounds all the psychological issues people are having. And now the state can't, well, they don't know how to cope with it because they think, part of them thinks, that if we are who we say we are, well, that means who are we? And we've already been telling the rest of the world that we're the Irish. We fended off a big bad old empire. We've got lots of fathers in our names, and we dance, and we do all the traditional stuff to bring in tourism. But yet they couldn't explain who were these people on the island? Who were travellers? So, yeah.
And I was wondering, sorry, Dylan.
Sorry, no, you're okay. I was just going to say that splitting people from their history is also you can imagine, as you can, from what that actually cutting people off from their history was also part of the original plan in the 16th century. You know, of course. You know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, about the racism, towards travellers from the settled community, if we're going to use those terms, but and I think for me it became very apparent as well, even just things like certain things highlighted, like with the Ukraine crisis, because there's the thing, well, these are refugees but they're white, so they're like us, so it's not the same as, so there's a difference in the treatment. But then, as you were saying, Bernard, like with travellers, there's not a skin colour, there's not a where have these people come from, so there's not those issues, but yet the racism is so ingrained and it's so acceptable, and it's just used everywhere. It's like it's part of, it's acceptable in a work, in a work environment, it's acceptable, it really, I know somebody said that to me is the last acceptable form of racism. But somebody said at in a focus group I was hosting, they said that the issue of feuding with the community, and that that it's like an internalized oppression, like I'm not like you, I don't want to be seen to be like you, and this kind of language of you're a holy show, and so that made me think, from listening to your kind of work, well, isn't that very possible kind of what's kind of going on here with the depth of the racism for the settled community, is like that the travellers are maybe a reminder of the root of our roots, a trigger, and then if that internalized oppression that wants to be pushed away as far as possible. I don't know if I'm making sense in the question, but that was...
No, absolutely, a lot of us, and it's a really, really big complex one itself. Even to take,
it's even a tricky one to talk about, because it's, you have to look at your own racism, where that's come from.
Because we're talking about sort of taking a step outside the colony and putting all the context, because to take it in the present now is just way too much. It's just too much stuff going on. So you have to find some psychological way of sort of taking a step back from it. And as we mentioned earlier about racism, is also a colonial construct. It was designed for the purposes of enslaving people for capitalism/colonization. So you're not quite sure what to think if you can't think of labels and so on and so forth. But all it is using psychological power to create a distance between ourselves and our thoughts, because our thoughts have been generated through institutions, through a language that didn't come from the island. That's another good one for you. Sorry, I'm on fire.
Yeah.
That clearer now?
I'm not sure if any of this is helping you whatsoever, because we're angry, but we're not blaming anyone. We're saying there is racism, but there isn't racism. So yeah, we can mind meld people sometimes. I think what we're really searching for is trying to be what you're actually doing. You've mentioned this about how the powers to be, they cling on to their labels and their identities, and they won't give them up and their fixed beliefs. And we're not trying to say they should. We need to keep them if you believe that is who you are. But afford us the opportunity and the investment and the infrastructure so we can create an art form to show the people or show everyone a world that we see and how we see it. And we see it in a way we don't blame anyone. Full stop. We believe that this is one huge situation where it's everybody's a victim, I believe, because it's so old, it's so widespread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like one of the reasons we would think exactly. That's why we would go back further as well. I would say that like you're on the right. Well, I would say that that's correct as well about what you were saying about you were asking about the link between trauma and various kinds of oppression and that. But I almost have a more mechanical view in the sense that why would Irish people end up persecuting travellers is probably partly what you're trying to get at, is it?
Yeah, well, it was kind of like the depth of the racism towards travellers and why it's, you know what I mean, and why it's not. I think like it's some of it's conscious, some of it's conscious and justified, and I think a lot of it is subconscious.
Yeah.
And that, I suppose, and then the impact. Well, I mean, obviously the impact of the racism in the community has been decimating, but also then like what I'm looking at the moment is like the horizontal violence within the community and that feuding in particular.
And are you linking the two things?
At the moment I'm just exploring them with you. You know, this is something that I suppose this is something that I'm just exploring. I'm very kind of visual person and I am an imaginative person, so it helps me to try to understand things, to try to imagine, which isn't a very sort of typical sort of researchy or scientific way of looking at things, but it's like what you keep saying, Bernard, about having to pull yourself out and kind of see like Ireland as a blank slate before. I kind of believe that if you can find different lenses to look at the same issue through, do you know what I mean? That it's like, like a prism or something, that you can see things you haven't seen before. So I suppose that's what I'm these are just things that I'm thinking about. They're kind of like thoughts that are kind of floating up here that I haven't landed, if that makes sense.
Well, I'd say there's a few complicated things going on there, but I would say that if you were to track the two mentalities, if you want to put it that way, or the two versions of the culture as we're looking at them, if you were to track them back along the lines of what Bernard's laid out there and what we were talking about of colonial history. So if you follow the thread of the settled community back far enough, you'll end up back in what used to be called the Pale, or just the English colony in Dublin, around that area. Okay, and the reason I would say it's important is because the Irish state itself, even to this day, is constructed all the way through the Middle Ages, is an English construction, and I think that's very important for us to understand, if you know what I mean, in the sense that the origins of any racism, and institutional racism in particular, is going to be is by following the thread through the Irish state and its laws. Or the origin of all the laws it has, its attitudes to people in the country, what it thinks are acceptable, civil Irish and wild Irish.
Yes.
Travellers, non-travellers, one's inside the Pale, one's outside the Pale, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so the Irish state in 1922, as we've maintains all of the English law. And in fact, the 1963 travel report even refers to vagrancy laws in the 1850s, which are direct descendants of the laws that were the old colonial laws in the 1840s. Sorry, in the 1540s, and even that far back, right? But the Vagrancy Acts in the 1847 are referenced in the 1963 report, even under the Irish state.
Yeah.
So they're still operating under a mentality and a legal construction that's completely based in the roots of it are in the English constructed state in Ireland.
Yes.
So this is why it's good to look at it through a lens of colonization. Now we have a large, as we go back, if we follow the Irish people, the travellers back in time, and other Irish people, we'll just end up in a broader and broader Gaelic society. You know, go back past the famine, and there's 3 million, 4 million people in the West speaking Irish, whatever, you know, across the country speaking Irish, outside, basically living outside the state system. And you go much further back, it's just going to get wider and wider until eventually settled people, as we would call them, are just a very small minority in the towns, if we go back 400 or 500 years. And if you follow what you're talking about lateral, what did you call it? Horizontal violence.
Horizontal violence, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's the same as follow the mentality of this, if you're looking at racism in the settled community, it's the spread of we would find the same kind of racism in the 15th or 14th century in the Pale against Irish people outside the Pale, right? And legal constructs to back it up.
Yeah.
Now, I would argue, I would say that's what we're looking at, is the spread of that after the Irish Free State or whatever in the Irish state. It basically is the spread of that mentality across the country is what we're talking about. But if you follow Irish the Gaelic culture back, you're going to find a completely different concept, completely different concepts that are not to do with the institutionalized racism and stuff, but what you're calling feudalism, or not feudalism, what you're talking about, horizontal violence, Irish society.
Yeah.
Okay, so leaving aside the problems of oppression and poverty and other problems like that are also part of the whole story. At the end of the day, the Irish people also are involved in Gaelic society is going to give you the clues as to what that's about as well. And Bernard can talk about that as well. But the whole point being that Gaelic society itself was a martial society, a warrior kind of a society, which prized, you know, martial sports on horseback and boxing and these kind of things. And it was an honor-based society. And me and Bernard have often talked about like something similar. We would, if we watched a movie about Japan, we would accept it, no problem. There's violence between clans. And we would watch an epic movie about it, The Last Samurai or something, and think this was no problem. This is totally understandable. That's the way it is. Okay, that's how the society is organized. And again, what we're looking at, what we would argue there is, but when the whole narrative, if it didn't happen in Japan, in Ireland, if Japan wasn't taken over by some entity that decided that all of what they're doing is the same as being a vagrant, and therefore they have to be marginalized and pushed aside, and any violence is not an expression of honor for a clan. It's actually just pathological, and therefore it's a problem to be dealt with by the health ministry. Okay, so
further proof of the
degeneracy,
or degeneracy, better word, exactly, of the people that you're targeting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I want to kind of justify or to excuse any form of violence. And I'm one of those travellers that grew up in one of these clan-based name, honour fighting. So we know what it's like to be in all kinds of trouble, unfortunately. But it's always more complex, and it always has been more complex. We just couldn't understand why the settled people couldn't understand. I mean, we would look at, in a way, say that these people shoot each other, these people bomb each other. We at least go out and box each other, and then most times and often shake hands and forget about it. It doesn't always go that way, but that's how you'd like it to go. But of course, it becomes more complex because now we're in an environment that it's strange, because I remember not having a formal education and not being able to use these kind of words. But at the same time, I never felt any less intelligent. I always knew I was intelligent even without a formal education. And what happens most time is the settled people get educated and they confuse it with intelligence. And this is what this whole culture thing is, that it's almost a form of superiority.
Yeah.
that's the way they were nurtured since they were children. They're like, hand up, put your hand down, to be on time, to be within the lines, and all this kind of discipline, slowly but surely in a process. And from one classroom to the next school, to one university to the next, we're all constructed inside what we say is an English colonial environment. So there is that kind of how you look at it. So some people never did. Nobody's conscious of this. Nobody's really even conscious that they're a traveller or settled. They're only conscious when it's in contrast to somebody else. You don't become consciously aware otherwise. So people in the settled population were never taught the history. And there's been a huge, quite a bit of evidence coming forward now that the state continues to suppress certain information when it comes to travellers. Like there's information where it might be on the segregated care homes, which is very similar to Canada and other Western parts where they're experimental with these ethnic groups. The state has separated all of what has happened to travellers to this day as separate as to what happened to other people in similar circumstances, care homes, institutions, and so on and so forth.
Skills, yeah.
But yeah,
it's an interesting giveaway what you were talking about, because you get the same in America with tribes, or maybe in India. I'm not sure about India, maybe with scheduled castes and all that kind of stuff. But in America, you definitely have that where do you remember that Bernard? It was I can't remember the Navajo or somebody, but they were talking about the only two departments dealing with them in the US was justice and health, and it's the same idea. Because the idea is.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just corrected. It was just that was Aldous Reed Jr. on African Americans in the 70s and the 80s.
That's right. Yeah, sorry, I'm wrong. Yeah, I'm wrong with the right idea in the sense that exactly. So they're talking about justice and health, and as we were pointing out, as Bernard had pointed out as well, in Ireland it's identical. It's that's a colonial construct in America without doubt, and we know in Ireland, but it's identical in Ireland where justice and health were dealing with traveller issues. And we were thinking this is remarkable because it's really to do with the fact that, it's internal. It's either criminal or there's or it's a problem, a health issue or a sociological problem, and it's framed as a problem from the start. There is no recognition of any valid culture going on in that sense, Well,
and I think you'll find the same thing again if you go to Canada.
I was in Canada, and there was the time they were doing the whole reconciliation piece. So they were rewriting the kind of the education books to include what had happened to First Nations kids, without obviously scaring the kids, so that this is what your grandparents were doing, but that's one of the pieces I
find very similar to South Africa. You'll find it in Australia and you'll find it in New Zealand. Again, we're making this comparisons because one, they're all sharing the same language. They all have origins from colonization. So it's been parallels that are almost striking. So again, it goes back to the Western mentality, the colonial mentality, the separate mentality. They all came from the East, with no disrespect. But back to the conflict part, we see it in one way. But at the same time, I was very young at the time. I was consciously aware that our other world around us was crumbling on top of us. Things were changing, and all this fear a lot of people have when they feel they want to go back to a certain time when things were really good in their neighborhood and they were young and everybody was nice and that world. But it's a bit like that because the outer world was kind of blurry to us because we didn't have the formal education, so we didn't really know what people with suits were doing in the first place up in the buildings and working in the buildings. So we know through TV there might be whatever cops and robbers and everybody had a role to play. But it was blurred out. We didn't have that formal level of education anyway to be engaging with these people. So we're kind of on our own frequency, so to speak. But it kept becoming eroded and eroded and eroded. So even we're like caught off guard because all this happened in one lifetime for myself. Strangely enough, was because one, I was called Irish traveller. I was also called an itinerant when I was growing up. I was also called a tinker when I was growing up. So didn't treat labels as old and as far back as they stretch back through the centuries that have an origin with English colonization were still used in my lifetime by people who were calling themselves Irish, but couldn't kind of recognize us being the same kind of Irish. So therefore we had to become an out group or other group and a failed group. It had to be a failed group because the narrative Enda Kenny was using in the Dáil as ethnicity. He said people within a people. He was consciously making these statements by saying that they are a failed settled people within our people. The genetics guy, his narrative, fair enough, admit it was just a narrative, but it was wrong. When we've talked to Cavieres, the scientist, I hope someday they make a life-size statue outside the Royal College of Surgeons in honour of his name, because of the irony, it was the pale that brought themselves down. But anyhow, we won't go into that. We did that for the arts. But his geneticist was that the travellers had diverged from the settled population. And we're saying there was no settled population. How could we diverge from the settled population? So when you say it like that, and then the Kenny is thinking it like that, if travellers diverged from the settled population, this means the settled population was the majority normal Irish, and the travellers broke away from us. Therefore, they must be failed Irish and a lower class Irish. So even them kind of words on the narrative, never the signs. We've never have an issue with the signs. Another thing with the markers, and you mentioned 1,000 years, because they come up with the signs, and some of the travellers were getting terrified of the idea of the signs. There was nothing wrong with the signs, and if there was or wasn't, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference anyways, because I'm not a geneticist. But what was wrong was the narrative that went with the signs, by saying that we had diverged, or travellers had a very, some had very distinct geneticists in terms of in-group. What they were missing there was, well, at any particular time, if you came from our world, a Gaelic world, you could be under martial law from 1 year to 60 years, where it was open killing people. Had no problem, no law to protect anyone. So they would kill the bards, they'd kill the Gallerglass, they'd kill the Gaelic culture, they'd take their belongings, they'd fund their soldiers, pay for land, keep the war going. This is how they did it. So all that is kind of playing out to some degree or another even today, because travellers are still having that a psychological exclusion. And why won't I mention the part why in the
Well, we're never integrated into the state. That's the simple point, isn't it? They're never integrated. The travellers just Irish people who are never integrated into the state at all. And so there's, if you look at another way, you could say there was a kind of a continual state of war that was never resolved. It's just left there like that, you know.
But even Catholic in the Protestant situation, where you mentioned also earlier on, well, we are also Catholics and Protestant. We do still come from that world also. But our issues predates the Catholic and the Protestant conflict. It's much older than the traveller conflict. Actual fact, we're back almost again to 1,000 years where the English thought it upon themselves. Let's rule Ireland. They're savages. They need to be ruled over. So it started 1,000 years ago, that whole colonial concept of othering others and so on and so forth. But yeah, and then you take Northern Ireland. You could say Northern Ireland at a physical, in the physical sense of it, is in the middle of the colonial battle with still the same English strong presence systems, not conflict between the communities. In the south of Ireland, people thought it was post-colonialism because the colonization would have ended. What I think what the vast majority of people around the world had missed was there was a psychological colonization of the people. Because going back again the centuries, the whole engineering idea was to shift the psyche of the Irish people. And you can only do that by institutions of education and coercion and so on and so forth. So I don't know if that helped either, but there you are.
It's peculiar. Sorry,
you go. No, you go ahead. You were going to add something there.
I was just going to say it's peculiar sometimes when we all speak English that we sort of also deny that something changed in the last 500 years. You know, we acknowledge that that the country was colonized, but on the other hand, and that it changed it to the degree that we have that everything about our lifestyles and the way, even the language we speak, changed. And yet, even though the language we speak changed, we still, as you said, it's not something that's
never spoken about.
Yeah, exactly.
Or examined on any kind of level, really.
Yeah, and it's very peculiar. And also, I would say, I was just going to say that's one probably the single, in history terms, one of the greatest myths of that's kind of implicitly taught by just not mentioning it in the Irish curriculum that I learned even in school, which would be that it just gives you this impression always that the settled community is the normal Irish community that extends all the way back into the past, and that it never really changed, and that travelers or known travelers must have been descended from some smaller community that was within that, wandering around just like it is now, if you know what I mean. Yeah. And therefore, but they never, again, it doesn't take into account what that we know the enormity of the colonial things that happened in Ireland, the wars and that, which were enormous. and yet we sort of have the two ideas at once. There's these enormous wars, and yet at the same time, all of this terrible colonization happened, and we had to change language, and loads of people were exiled and died. And yet at the same time, we believe that nothing really changed, and settled people were always there going about their business in little cottages all the way through. And it's the two can't be true, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So as we go back, like there is no, like we said with even with the geneticists, we're missing that part of the history. And so when they interpreted the genetics, they interpreted it in terms like Bernard had said, that as if oh well, travellers must have split from this settled community that's the normal community in the country. But the time of the split would mean that there wasn't any particular the settled community was not the majority in the country. It was only in the certain cities, and therefore it wasn't even possible that could happen. But it's exactly what you said. That history is missing. So the narrative gets repeated wrong, backed up wrong all the time. You know. So,
it can be quite frightening. It can be quite frightening for a lot of people because it hits the core of identity, as in who am I? You know, if you're a fan of Alan Watts and people like that, you'd know there is no I. It's a creative figure in the first place. And if you go back young enough, your mind was blank. It was built up with sensations. It didn't know its name. It was given a name. It was given an occupation. It was given a label. It was given ethnicity and culture and identity. So all of these things are mind absorbed from the external world. What I'm saying is that the vast majority of people have absorbed a mentality that was not from the island. They absorbed it from an English construct of how the Irish should be and how they should live. Nothing against the old English, anything like that, or Dublin or the Pale, because the whole idea of this is to say that we're all victims. And there is possibility ways out of this, because if you look at the mental health statistics of Ireland in general, it's been pretty much off the charts. Third highest in Europe for depression and schizophrenia and bipolar. Endless. And part of me is kind of convinced is that it's all to do with the narrative. People who go about their business believing I am from the working class community, I am from the middle class, and I've always been here, and I've always spoken this language, and houses have always been here, and nobody knows who travellers are. That has to be a psychological issue, because we're in a small island, we're an indigenous culture. Indigenous, again, it's down to mentalities. I mean, the island was an island of invasion, and then there was a big block of ice before that. So nobody ever came from Ireland. We all came to the island sometime or another. So we've no problem with that. The only problem we have is when we say indigenous is that we're basing it on a culture that was organic. It wasn't constructed out of colonization. The English language is only 1,500 years old. The Irish monks who taught the English how to read and write and put space between the words in the first place. So we know Gaelic culture is much, much older than the English culture. So when we're here today being almost, and again, it's sad and scary all in one, because nobody knows. Nobody could have known. If you're telling me, and Dylan was telling me that you couldn't find it in the high-ranking institutions of Ireland, how was other people going to know? How were they ever going to know the things we're talking about? And if they hadn't known who travellers were, they would have a sense of their own identity, their name. Because again, Gaelic has nothing to do with Irish, nothing to do with Ireland. It's much older than that, much broader than that. And it crosses dialects and languages and cultures and skin complexions. So it's none of that. So whatever Gaelic is, we know it's something outside the colonial mentality. In other words, we cannot repeat, emulate, or copy the source code of an English mentality. Because if we do, we'll just extend and repeat the same process with the same systems, and we'll end up creating other middle classes and other working classes. Yeah. So we need something that's different. Sorry, I thought I was on for
sorry.
Yeah.
I'll just say this. That reminded me of something very important. Is that when it's, because it's constructed as a colonial thing, it was a lot of the laws, and that's what you referred to with that court decision that occurred with the housing and travellers in Clare, I think it was, and the judge's decision was that the laws hadn't changed. Laws in the state hadn't changed in 1922. Before that had been designed, obviously, to target certain ways of life and certain cultures, and therefore they made a decision in that one that to sort of allow that to extend the definition of a house. Actually, it was to extend the definition of a home to include homes that weren't fixed, if you know what I mean. And this was very important from our perspective, and it went almost unnoticed. But it was very important from our perspective, the Supreme Court recognizing that actually English law and the system itself had been built to target Irish culture and and gradually to change Irish culture into this acceptable form of English Irish culture, whatever you want to call it, into this settled world that was acceptable to Dublin. And the reason I would say it is really important to understand that is that when we don't address the colonialism, don't address those laws, they just continue doing that repeatedly all the time, automatically, like a machine that gets rid of. And that's why we would say that things like Irish language struggles, you know, certain parts of the country are struggling more than others for the same reasons, discrimination of sorts. Rural Ireland, if you want to put it that way, the Irish language, travellers at on the front edge of it, but all are just and loads of the settled community in different ways. But it's actually all part of the same continuum of not addressing laws that were actually designed to discriminate against anything that came from most of Irish indigenous culture.
And people are less likely to address anything if it's working for them, you know, or to look at something or investigate something. It's what, you know, when it's working for them.
That's what I can relate to also, and I've seen this with travellers and travel organisations, and you'll see it because the institution is so powerful itself. It doesn't matter if you're a traveller or Roma, or if you're Black, or if you're from India, or from any other ethnic group. That you will end up adopting an institutional way of doing things. This is why we see we're talking about Aldaf Reed just talking in America how Black people are fighting for equality and justice, but they're copying the same systems. In other words, they're taking up the same roles. So what they're doing is really just extending the systems and end up pushing people in further into destitute because they're telling them this is the way to do it, do what I'm doing. But not everyone can go to university, not people can get a job and so on and so forth. And they might want to actually live in different ways with different styles, different customs. And I'm hoping that some way through the arts in which yourself is that we're trying to create that image world where things can be different. It doesn't change anyone. In actual fact, what we're saying is back to the island, which is clearly missing for a very long time in the first place. And if you go back in your history, people like Douglas Hyde, about the de-Anglicization of the institutions at the beginning of the 19th century, Jack B. Yeats, James Conley, all these people back then were also talking about you need to change the institutions. No matter what you do, change the institutions.
Are you including the church when you're saying that?
Well, yeah, well, it's well, if we take a huge step out and we go back way back into Rome, there's three evil mentalities operating. One is the empire, the other one's called the privateers, and the other one's the belief system. And the empire thing weaponized Jesus, turned him into a weapon, they masked around the world, and the privateers leached on. And if you come right up to this present time in Europe, who leads the world? Religion, companies, and governments, which is pretty much where it started with Rome, I guess. So yeah, the church would be in there for sure.
Roman Catholic Church would be part of the same story, as it didn't really come to power in Ireland until under the Empire in the 1830s.
Under the Empire, and can you explain to me, like, and I'm supposing conscious of time as well, but can you explain to me, like, what is the hold that I perceive that the church has over travellers? Because I perceive it as a hold. Yeah, that's now my, you know, because there seems to be a loyalty to the church that I can't understand it, why it's there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to explain that, obviously, but we'll let Bernard deal with that one, I think. But I would say though that I'm not so sure. Maybe they've succeeded. Maybe the church succeeded in the last couple of. No, I'm not going to say I know all about this, but I would say that maybe the church succeeded in the last 150 years in transferring to itself the loyalty of travellers whose religion. Because I would just as easily say that in many cases there was a lot of clashes culturally between the Roman Catholic Church and travellers, in terms of like trying to stop them going to holy wells, disapproving of them going up on the mountains, disapproving of sites that they regarded as being almost pagan. And that would be our experience, certainly my experience, even just personally around here, would be that the church had looked down on a lot of those things, and yet. I would agree with you that they are the people and travellers in particular are very devout about their beliefs, but I don't see it as being the same as I know that you see people were surprised that before the famine, right just before the famine, Irish people were not engaged in it. They were very, they had their beliefs, they were very strong beliefs, but they weren't quite the same or understandable as, again, as the two divisions we're talking about. The Dublin area, the government, the Pale and all that kind of place had been traditionally very strongly Roman Catholic and had the hierarchy of the church and the bishops and all of that structure that was Roman. And in fact, it claimed superiority over the Irish people in general based on that. Yeah. And it said that the people, the wild Irish out beyond the Pale boundary and that, weren't even Christian, was the idea in the 12th century, even though it's a ridiculous statement. But because it was a very old form of Christianity that included all kinds of traditional pishogues and beliefs and ancient prayers and holy wells and, you know, sites on islands and cliffs and things like this. But this was open air form of ancient form of Christianity mixed with the old religion even. It was something that the church kind of tried to either take over, as we know, or adapt or whatever. But it wasn't. It really, Irish people in 1820s, 30s, 40s, they didn't go to church to get married. They didn't go to church to have Christmas. They didn't do it. Any of these things took place in the house or they took place at holy sites.
So I'm trying to get to that point that the whole island is traumatized. We have a lot of trauma. You know, this feeling we get in our gut, an acid burning feeling. I've always attributed that to like a subconscious trauma, something that we wouldn't even no longer recognize because we're born in and out of this institution, unchanged for centuries, but we're always told to accept it as reality. And I think that has played a lot of psychological conflict with a lot of people. So I'm thinking, hoping through the arts, we reset all of that and try to start again.
Brilliant. Well said. Well said. Dylan, do you have anything you want to say?
I think, yeah, well, I'd say it's be predictable enough in a way. It's that I think that, yeah, well, Bernard, you remember first you were saying, right, we talking about the fact that if we need to do more research, we need to put everything in the context of the actual colonial history. That's first. I also think that the original Gaelic revival and the Celtic, that kind of thing in the past, they were kind of on the same path. And I think some of the better visionaries in that actually had a similar idea. And I think they were kind of correct about it. And really just looking for equal rights for the oldest culture on the island is actually the simple version of what the whole battle has been about. And that automatically would reconnect Irish people to that history across the board. And you would hope, as Bernard had said, it would have the effect of taking the pressure, because awareness of where the state laws were kind of automatically marginalizing and cutting through traveller culture, and, you know, as Bernard says, othering them or whatever, all that kind of thing. We would be able to consciously alter them and, you know, move forward in that regard. But I think, yeah, we can't do it unless it's, yeah, we need to get that equal rights for that for the Gaelic world, really, in a sense, and that's right across the board, isn't it? The language, every Irish person, and even non-Irish people living in the country.
Yes, bro. Also,
everyone's affected, because actually, it effective like a curtain. It actually very effectively cuts us from anything beyond that 16th century. It becomes opaque. And therefore, we're not able to draw on it artistically or otherwise.
That's exactly the word I was thinking of before I came on to meet you. So that it is. It's like that past is opaque. It's the absolute opposite of transparent, isn't it?
Yes, and it's blocked, and it's quite. Partly it was blocked on purpose, and partly not.
We're playing the strategy of being careful because patterns of histories keep playing out, and we don't want to get our heads chopped off, or we don't be hanged in Dublin. So we're projecting everybody as victims. So it's a bit like the life of Brian. You can't get angry if everybody's victims, because there's nobody blaming anyone.
Yeah,
so we're hoping to maneuver around that way, and hopefully.
Well, your Travision idea is part of that, because we sort of tried to. Bernard wanted to create a kind of a media or a foundation, or something like that. That's kind of consciously doing that in order to create a kind of something traveller led, something with that mentality, something that isn't a state medical intervention or the Justice Department,
Yes.
but something that not just travellers but settled people could come to study colonialism, if you know what I mean. Or
Yeah, absolutely, and acknowledge, because I don't think we do.
People can adopt this system, but they wouldn't be even aware they've adopted it because they would have perceived it as reality. So when we see like in the post-colonialist people, we can see the native people now with the suits, and they're doing all the power to be Western, because the Western told them that was the way to be successful, like at a micro level to a global level. It's one of the same because it's one huge big institution. Not to scare people that thinking they're living inside the matrix or anything, but it's a good comparison when we separate between work and reality. I would imagine reality for most people is something like being on the sun, in the river, in the woods, climbing a mountain. That's reality. That's to fix something that was there long before we got here. And the other form of reality is the institutionalized one. The towns, the cities, the villages, the names, the labels, the occupations, the rules, and we adopt them eventually as reality. And all it really does is disconnects us from the land and what should be reality, a more nuance or a new connection with the land, I guess. All that has been severed off by institutions, I guess.
I say, sorry, I was just going to say one thing, if just briefly, because you were saying you're thinking visually about things. And I just going to say this thing. I remember we learned, I don't remember if it was like archaeology. There was an old military historian who pointed out at one stage in the 60s or something that if we go through that bottleneck where a lot of Irish cultural and this buildings themselves, everything was destroyed, all the churches were burnt out, all the various wars in the 17th century and 16th century. But he had pointed out in the 1960s or so that after a big search, that about only from the Gaelic world before that, from 1,500 years, 2,000 years of history or something, only something like 26 pictures actually survived of Irish people or of Irish anything really. That there was no imagery. There was no images of the costumes. There was no images of people, of the knights on horses. There was no images of, all the iconography in the churches was gone. There's a tiny part that survives on Clare Island, which tells us that there was entire stories painted on the insides of churches. All we were left with was a couple of books surviving, but the actual imagery of we lost access to the costumes. We lost access to. We don't understand what Irish people looked like. We didn't understand what they were wearing. We didn't understand how they were doing their hair. We lost access to almost everything, and that was a destruction on a scale that's hard for people to actually imagine.
Actually fathom, yeah.
Yeah, and therefore, right now as well, we have that was part of the Celtic revival actually in the 19th century, was trying to recreate kind of like, obviously amongst a certain privileged few mainly, but still it became a mass movement. But partly the arts part of it was, and what we were focusing on, and it's extremely important because they're trying to reconnect or trying to build that back up. Now obviously it got mixed up with nationalism and stuff, like we might maybe get to do a light version. But it's still very important because we're not able to access the history. Means we're not drawn on a lot of stuff. Everything from design to of furniture to costumes. I mean, it's the materials. Everything is kind of it's very hard. People are kind of trying to access. I see people looking for that or trying to access all the time, and they don't know why it's not there.
Access it from our imaginations or from our subconscious. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and it's just missing. And so there's this enormous project,
Trying to connect and reach out.
Yeah.
Anyone that ends up going looking for that or Googling for that, or there's it can be curiosity, but I think some people feel that there's something isn't quite right in the world.
Something isn't quite right.
And they're seeking it out and they're trying to find what's behind all this, what's making all this happen. I would imagine from Jamaica to parts of America, diaspora, and all these people have the very same situation we have in Ireland, disconnected. But nobody knows even how to talk about the disconnection because they don't really think they're disconnected, but yet they feel disconnected. So they don't know where to even start to make it into a conversation. Of course, what do we do in Ireland? What good is history? What's the good to talk about the past? What good is the Irish language? Well, you're primitive. It's almost ghost statements when you chase after them to go nowhere because they mean nothing. History is important for people. If you go to the doctor, they'll ask you about your personal history. You go to the bank, they'll ask you about your financial history. So history is important when it needs to be.
Especially if it's especially when it's if it's not based on the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, then it's
Really kind of a Truman Show kind of involved.
It is a kind of a Truman Show. When I got back from Canada, I remember I had this really strange dream, and I dreamt that there was a truck pulled up to the house, and there was in the truck there were 3 First Nations people, and they had the long dark hair, and the truck was loaded full of long poles, like the kind of poles you make totem poles out of, right? And they brought it up to the house, and I didn't know what to do or what they wanted me to do with the poles. And they shook their heads at me and they left. And it started to rain. And my house was painted blue at the time. And all the blue paint started washing off the house. And underneath it was dirty white. And all I could think of, all I felt in the dream was this shame at the dirty whiteness of my house, right? And when I woke up, it was the first time I kind of really felt that, like, the kind of the shame of the Irish of that oppression piece, and kind of got me thinking about, you know, the links between the colonial oppression and it. But you reminded me of that when you were talking there, Dylan, just about like visualization and stuff like that, and that dirty white piece that came to me in the dream, you know.
And it's almost at a very subconscious level for a lot of us. We talked about the whole taking a step back and looking at this kind of line going that way. You'll see where penal laws and humiliation and blame.
The humiliation, exactly. And I love what you said about that girl, you know, realizing the racism is a construct, because if white people can be racist towards each other, I mean, that's just brilliant.
That takes a load off, because again, as travelers, we didn't know the things we know now. So we were kind of mind boggled. How are we thinkers? How are we itinerants? How are we these travelers? Some of us never traveled the road. Some of us are generations in houses. So how could they even pick us out? How did they identify us? So all these things running through your head. And of course, the vast majority of people didn't even know why they were picking on you in the first place.
No.
There was a subconscious environment that told them, hey, you can push these guys around. There's no one to come back at you. The law doesn't care about them. The state doesn't care about them. And there was that kind of fear then where travel.
I don't want to be the same as you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the strongest stuff, if you ever research it, you might find it's actually people with the same surnames as the travellers that are actually most bitter towards travellers. And none of us had a choice in or out of it, because these labels were here when we were born. We had no say in the matter. So I think it's a whole lot of unlocking at a global level. Because again, we go back to the default. We're all human beings. We all have one origins, let alone be different complexions. So we have that. That's a starting point. And everything else then is mentalities, cultures, and perspectives.
Guys, it's really interesting. Loads to digest. And
I'll save this and I'll send you a copy you can download.
You're very good. Yeah, because it'll definitely shape what I'm trying to frame here. So thank you.
And I wish you luck with it. And hopefully we'll cross paths.
The paths will cross again. Exactly. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Have a lovely evening. Lovely to meet you.
Bye now.